let me start by saying in the last panel, we learned that science has lost its trust and respect. Now, when it comes to economics, God help us. Economics never had it before all this started. But what I'd like to do in a couple of minutes, Jeffrey, to respond to that question,
do we have is this microphone loud enough, you think?
Am I...
yeah, okay.
Am I okay?
Yeah, now you're good. Yeah.
Okay. I've been struck by your confession last night that after publishing 1,000 articles...
2,000, yeah.
2,000. After writing hundreds, you still can't explain how this thunderous event of mid-March 2020 happened.
True.
You know, I would call it a lights out for free society kind of event. Well, I'm here today to relieve your mind. I have the answer, and it's in one word. In my very best Dustin Hoffman graduate style, the new plastics is fiat. Okay? And fiat, by that I mean money printing at the Fed. I mean, there was such a fantastic outpouring of Fed credit, monetization of the debt during that period, that it literally unleashed the Congress to spend and borrow in ways that are crazy beyond anything that's imaginable. And I'm going to just throw out a couple statistics in a moment. And that, in turn, bought off the entire public response to what was really a kind of totalitarian event in the midst of our, day-to-day economic and social life. Now, I think one way to measure that, remember, what I'm saying is, and probably wouldn't strike everyone here as the obvious thing to think about, is that the route to medical freedom and all the things that we've been talking about here is shackling the Fed. It didn't quite. Now, I don't want to sound as probably monotonous on this topic as Ron Paul, but I am. Okay. Because if we go through the logic of it, I think you'll see quite clearly how significant this is. Now, the first thing I want to do is just remind everyone of how sweeping, how thunderous this lockdown event was that was triggered when Trump held his famous press conference on March 16. In an ordinary recession, at the bottom, even the bad ones like the Great Recession, GDP drops by about 7%. That's the worst quarter, the bottom quarter, 7% on an annualized basis. During Q2 2020, right at ground zero of the lockdowns, GDP dropped by 35% at an annual rate, or 5 times the worst thing we've ever seen, including going back to the Great Depression. Another sort of fun fact, in a normal recession at the bottom, the worst monthly numbers you ordinarily get in terms of unemployment is 500,000 or 600,000 a month. In April 2020, the number of new unemployed was 21 million. So we had like a 40x event in terms of its impact, on the Main Street economy. Last, in a normal recession, the one place that is kind of ducks the hit when it comes to a recessionary downturn is the leisure and hospitality sector. For some reason, people keep going to bars, they keep going to movies, they spend money, and so there's never a downturn. In April 2020, this time, employment in the leisure and hospitality, and that's restaurants, bars, movies, sporting events, and so forth, dropped by 58%. Now, you may say, well, how big is 58%? 58% is so big that it was the equivalent of wiping out all the jobs that have been created in that sector, which was our growth sector in the economy, for the previous 41 years. It took us all the way back to April 1979, when as a young congressman I was beating up on Jimmy Carter for ruining the economy, okay? And in April 2020, we had fewer hours worked in leisure and hospitality than we did way back then. So that's how thunderous it was. Now, why didn't we have a huge public uprising? Why weren't they out on the streets with torches, out on the streets, with pitchforks ready to prosecute the governing forces that were making this happen? And the answer came 2 days later. Now, you remember Trump started standing around like a deer in a headlight. He turns the podium over to Deborah Birx, I called her the scarf lady, who tried to explain that, yes, we're going to 2 weeks to flatten the curve, and they were pressing her on, well, what exactly are you saying? Are we going to close every restaurant in the country, et cetera, et cetera? And she was hemming and hawing and double talking in her best style. And finally, Fauci standing behind them in a line, he couldn't take it anymore. He barged right up to the podium, pushed her out of the way, and said, "Let me read." And he read, "Bars, restaurants, food courts, gyms, other indoor, other outdoor venues where groups of people congregate should be closed, full stop. Step back into line, smiling, from corner to beaming from ear to ear, as if the Almighty had spoken." And that's where we were. And it would have caused this reaction, in my view, save for one thing. 2 days later, Trump put out a very famous tweet in which he said, "Don't be troubled. Help is on the way. We're sending money. You didn't cause the China virus. And therefore, we've got everything under control." And within days, they passed the CARES Act, $2.2 trillion, that no one had any idea what was in there. They passed 2 more follow-on acts in December and March the next year. So this is a 12-month period. $6.6 trillion was shoved into the economy in a period of 12 months. And so then you would say, well, how big is $6.6 trillion? It's 150% of the entire budget of the United States in 2019, the year before the pandemic. 150%. And that's everything. Defense, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the Forest Service, student loans. Everything in the entire budget was only $4.5 trillion, including, that I would normally throw in the Tea Tasters Board, but that was the one thing we were able to get rid of during the Reagan Revolution against big government. So it was no longer there. But everything else, added up to $4.5 trillion. Here was $6.5 coming in that short period of time. And it's more than just the size of that number, which is astronomical, flooding into the economy. Households got $2 trillion in the stimmy checks and the toppers for unemployment. Business got $2 trillion, beginning with, the so-called PPP, payroll protection program, which was $800 billion of loans, of which 98% were forgiven within a few months. And you could go on down the line, but that all came flooding in. And it was so enormous that it basically changed the whole psychology, the whole political climate in which this totalitarian medical, emergency was being imposed. Now, I want to use 3 examples to give you quickly some idea of how extensive this was. I take the bottom of the rung, the middle family, and the top of the economic ladder. if you took someone basically at the minimum wage, 20 years old, no family, you know, doing whatever 20-year-olds do now, he normally got laid off, would have received $350 a month in the average state unemployment. No big thing. That's kind of a 20,000 a year salary, annualized. It's not anything you can make a living on. They came along and said, we're going to give everybody a $600 a week topper on top of the normal unemployment. So all of a sudden now, even the minimum wage guy that didn't, you know, expect that much in life at that point was getting $1,000 a week, $50,000 annual rate of pay, and it wasn't, you know, a princely living I'm talking about. It's just no one was going to complain too much. They weren't going to march on Washington at $50,000 a year. Now take a family of 4, 2 wage earners, 2 kids, and maybe they got a little side gig selling home-baked cookies on the internet. What did they get? Well, they both got laid off. They both got the $50K a year. They both got 3 rounds of stimmy checks for themselves and for their kids. They probably got some PPP money for their business because they may have had one employee that they kept on. They all got huge enhanced tax credits. Remember, those tax credits were blown way up. So the bottom line is at the middle, there's $100,000 a year flowing through all of these spigots, all of these mechanisms that were thrown into the $6.5 trillion sight unseen because they passed it so fast they had no idea what they were doing. Then let's get to the top finally. The stock market dropped for about 3 days, and then it was off to the races because obviously the Fed was printing money at $120 billion a month. That is new money, $120 a month, flooding in. Wall Street took off, and obviously it was off to the races from there. What did that do for the top 1% of households? Okay, the average household in the top 1%, you know, has had a net worth of about $25 million when this event happened. Within 4 quarters, their net worth had gone to $35 million. Okay, the top 1%, and that's only 1.3 million households in America, picked up a cool $12 trillion of additional net worth. The average top 1% picked up another $10 million each, and so at the bottom, at the middle, at the top, everybody is happy, at least from an economic point of view, and that's why there was no protest. That's why there was no, as I remember back when I was in Congress, no tractorcade going to Washington complaining that you're destroying our living and so forth. Now, you can say, well, how is that going to be prevented ever again in the future? And the answer is they never, ever, even with Donald Trump ready to sign anything that came across his desk, because he never saw a debt that he didn't like, obviously. But how did that happen? It happened only because the Fed was standing at the ready, printing money like there was no tomorrow. At the beginning of this crisis in late 2019, the balance sheet of the Fed was about $3.5 trillion. It had taken 106 years from the opening of its doors in 1914 to get to that level, 3.5 trillion. Within 2 years, when they finally stopped the printing press in March 2022, the balance sheet was $9 trillion. In other words, they printed $5.5 trillion in a compact period of time that distorted and contorted and changed everything. It absorbed all the Treasury debt. You know, during that period, the Treasury borrowed $6 trillion in 2 years. It was all, most of it was picked up, monetized by the Fed. That kept interest rates low. No one's complaining. And so we end up tolerating what was really an outrageous attack on a free society, on a free economy, economy, on the Bill of Rights, and all the rest of it, including especially, and I heard a few examples of this today, of people who had spent a lifetime building equity in their little neighborhood restaurant or their neighborhood tavern or their, gym or whatever, shut down, not just for a few days or 2 weeks or a month, but for a year or two, and destroyed in the process. All of that happened without a political reaction, because at the end of the day, the Fed was printing the money, the Congress was spending and borrowing the money, the public was flooded with totally unnatural levels of cash flowing into the system, and as a result, we had a huge failure of governance. So what do? We have to go after the Fed. And that's another whole story, but until you shackle that institution, we're never going to get our fiscal house in order. If we don't get our fiscal house in order, the politicians will find plenty of ways to bribe, to pay off, and to allow the kind of, outrageous assaults on individual liberty and freedom that happened during that period. Anyway, in my view, that's the lesson.
Then you had the inflation kick in and steal all the fake wealth, right? I mean, 20 cents on the dollar, basically. Gigi, something very similar happened in Australia, am I right? I mean, the story parallels very closely.
Very much. Well, first I want to thank David for a really masterful overview of the economics of the COVID era. That's fantastic. And yes, we did have a very similar story. So in Australia, we had the stimulus package known as JobKeeper that went to all the various people in the economy, many of whom got way more from the government than they possibly could have in the economy, and that gave them the habit of suckling at the government teat. And we already sort of had that in the culture, even more so than in America, I think. And I've actually written about this. The nationhood story of Australia is not one of revolutionary uprising against a powerful force, but rather bringing the power with you from the UK and looking up to it, because it was a really hostile environment in Australia. So when things get tough, the Australians look to the government, and this is exactly what happened during COVID. And even those JobKeeper payments, those stimulus payments, went into the calculation of GDP. So it even helps disguise how bad this was, right? And in fact, just as with the Fed printing money, we had the RBA, the Reserve Bank of Australia, our central bank also, singing from the same song sheet, and the central bank governor at the time, very unwisely, I think, in 2021 said something like, well, we're not going to raise interest rates until 2024. And then, of course, they started raising them way before then, and then that man lost his head, or well, not his head, but his job, and really took a scapegoat fall for what was truly much more of a broad sort of culpability of the people in charge, both on the fiscal side and the monetary side. But I do disagree with you on one thing. And this comes from, I guess, my perspective as a kind of, behavioral economist, a more broad-minded economist. I think a lot about the psychologies involved, and so the social psychologies and the anthropological, cultural issues that are also in play. From my perspective, it was not that the governments did wrong things to the people who weren't clamoring for it, and then the people sort of got paid off to not complain. It was much more that the politicians were the writing on the wall in mid-March 2020, because before then they were not saying such ridiculous things about COVID as they did afterwards. Certainly in Australia, we had our PM saying, well, you know what, COVID's not that bad for most people, but if you're old, you might want to worry about it a little bit. This is early March 2020. And then once the ICL modeling came out, and the pictures from Milan, and the videos from China, and the body bags, the freezer trucks from New York, all that stuff, perpetuated everybody's fear that had already been building and ramped it up to a huge level. And people were so petrified that the politicians realized in order to keep their seats, they needed to be seen to do something about this great, feared problem. And it didn't really matter whether that thing had anything to do with reducing the threat of COVID. It just had to seem sort of at a surface level to be connected somehow and be able to be wrapped in a flag. And so lockdowns were the thing. China had done it. Well, why not? Let's try this, right? And it sold. And then once you're going to lock down people, in order for them not to starve and truly get desperate and then truly come to their senses, because otherwise their children can't eat, you have to follow it up with a stimulus package. And so that's what happened in Australia. And so yes, there was a buying off, but I don't think that the politicians were the first movers. The first movers were the very scared population. And they were the ones who then kind of, in a sense, forced the politician's hand. I mean, that's what the politicians would say. I've had this conversation with many people about, well, they couldn't politically have done anything else. Well, they could have if they'd had courage, if they'd cared about their population.
Of course, there hadn't been a central bank, maybe.
Perhaps. But I think it's very unlikely that, I mean, maybe there are some really good leaders in the past we could look to and say, well, if they had been in those positions of authority at the time, would they have said, no, what I'm seeing here is a mass hysteria. I must, first of all, tamp down the fear. That's job one, right? When you are scared out of your mind, you're going to make bad decisions. You're going to be demanding bad things from the government. So job one for the government is tamp down the fear and then assess the situation and give good data, good information to people and give a reasonable story that says, look, we've got this virus's number, it's the coronavirus, we've seen 4 of these things in the past, we basically know how to handle this stuff, sanitation is the big way to save lives, so let's focus on those things and protect the elderly as much as possible and just keep going.
And you did this, Gigi. I mean, one of the things that during those bad times and those months that I saw was Gigi Foster, a video of you on Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and she's battling through like 9 experts. And it wasn't
9, it was like 3.
Well, no, it was, I remember it, whatever it was, but it was really something, and they were whipping up faith. She just took them on one by one, and over the course of a very long period, and just ferociously destroyed them, actually. And it was very encouraging for me, and I immediately wrote you.
Well, that's very kind. I don't think that your impression of those incidents is shared by many in Australia. I mean, it was a quite easy thing to do because, I've never been so sure that I was right about anything in my life. I'm sure that's probably true for you too, right? And probably many people in this room. You have to make judgment calls in science all the time, and every judgment call is, on the edge, and you don't know for sure. But with this, it was just so bleedingly obvious that we were doing so much damage. And it was so impossible to get that message across to people who've been caught up in the fear. I remember coming off the stage one of those times, I think it was the April 2020 ABC Q&A experience, coming off the stage and chatting with this woman who had been on with me, and she sort of looked at me with this sort of kind of expression on her face as if she had just discovered some enlightened, version of a new reality that had never occurred to her before. And she said, I think I'm starting to see your point. And this is after, an hour and a half of saying, are you a granny killer? Do you want people to die? Right?
I remember.
Kind of stuff. People just couldn't understand costs. And this is one of the things that was sacrificed on the altar of COVID was basic economic tools were just tossed out the window. And it wasn't the first time. I remember a conversation with somebody in my department. So I work in a university, in a mainstream university, still have my job amazingly. And most of all my colleagues think I'm totally nuts, of course. But before COVID, I remember having a conversation with this one person who's a very careerist, kind of standard, young, ambitious, economist, wants to get published in the good journals, wants to get the grant money, doesn't really have any tether to the community's needs, standard kind of picture. And I remember just him casually saying that, well, of course, it's very important to consider costs and benefits of anything, although, obviously with climate, we would, pretty much pay anything to make sure that doesn't happen. And I remember thinking, it was already kind of a habit of thinking, the great big thing, whatever's in, the mainstream.
Economics matters so long as somebody else doesn't matter more.
Right. As long as somebody doesn't tell me that this thing matters more. And so that was primed, and so that just kicked in. So we forgot about cost-benefit analysis, we forgot about trade-offs, we forgot about opportunity cost, and that was never a kind of a big set of beliefs or frameworks in the political class anyway, but it became just completely lost.
It was just crazy. Why? It's so hard to ask these questions because it doesn't make any sense. I don't have the answers. But we know there's some relationship of some uncertain sort between money printing and the consequences of inflation. Mm-hmm. Why did we pretend for the better part of a year like that didn't exist?
Well, the inflation happened almost instantly, but the first round of inflation happened in Wall Street, in the canyons of Wall Street. Yeah. And the financial markets took off, and if you look at any, the Dow or the S&P 500 or NASDAQ or any of the rest of them, they were soaring for a year. That was absorbing the first round of all that credit. But it takes a while to work its way through the world economy. The effect of the lockdown was to disrupt the supply supply chains, which had been offshored for the last 25 years. And as a result of that offshoring, there had been a tremendous deflation in the cost of goods in the United States. This is like a figure that's almost too crazy to believe, but it's BLS, so it's got to be true, right? Durable goods between 1996, when the China, export factories really got going, and late 2019, right before all this started, the index declined by 40% over that period. Nothing goes down by 40% in this world, and yet that's what they said. Now, part of it was just screwy BLS, but part of it was we were arbitraging cheap labor out of the rice paddies of China and its supply chain. All of that made for a period of time when inflation was artificially and unsustainably low. But when the supply chains got totally disrupted as a result of the shutdowns, all bets were off, and essentially the suppressed inflation of the previous decade eventually got unleashed. Now, the lockdowns and the stimmies caused so much economic dislocation and distortion that it's really hard to believe. I'll give you one or two examples. Normally, if you looked at the data on a year-over-year basis, durable goods consumption in the United States would increase by 70 billion, 100 billion. That was kind of the number year after year, with a little bit of growth. In the year ending in April 2021, after 3 rounds of stimmies, and after a full year of lockdown, so people couldn't spend any money on services, they couldn't go to the bar, they couldn't go to the restaurant, they couldn't go to the movie, etc. All this cash was building up, and then the government shoving all this cash to a lot of people that didn't need it, not just the people who were unemployed, but everybody. 100 million households got this. The spending on the only thing that was safe, a delivery from Amazon to your front doorstep where you didn't have to touch anybody or get near anybody, durable goods spending increased at a 1 trillion year-over-year rate, or 10 times the normal. And it was that massive increase in demand and therefore shipments that basically depleted the entire supply chain. Every warehouse in the country was totally depleted. The ships coming across the ocean were slowed down. Even in China, the factories were under various kinds of lockdown orders. All of a sudden, this great supply chain that had kept prices falling in the entire durable goods sector for 10 years was disrupted. The inventory was totally depleted, and people were spending like there's no tomorrow, ordering from Amazon because it's the only thing they could do as they were locked down at home waiting for someone to tell them that, that this too would end. And that created, it twisted the U.S. economy just like a pretzel. And that kicked off the inflation. And by the time the Fed discovered that it wasn't transitory, all bets were off, because there was an enormous amount of build-up inflation in the system, which is going to be with us for a good period of time to come. So I guess the lesson is, don't shut down a $25 trillion economy, because you're going to create nightmares that you can't even begin to imagine, down in the nooks and crannies and day-to-day plumbing of the economy. And second, don't flood the system with cash if you do that, because people at home weren't spending their money anyway. And I can tell you where we are now, and this is why the Fed is having such a hard time bringing inflation under control. Normally, the households in America, and there's 130 million households, carry cash balances. And I'm talking about bank accounts, money market accounts, and good old, greenbacks. Carry cash balances of about 10 to 12 trillion. And that's just the working cash in the system. It comes and goes, it gets spent. It flows, circulates in the system. After a year and a half of these lockdowns, which was forced non-consumption, and all of the stimmies that I talked about, the $6 trillion, the cash balance in the system went up to $19 trillion. So all of a sudden, there's $7 trillion more of cash floating around in the system, in bank accounts, in wallets, etc. And that is like a complete aberration. Nothing like this has ever been seen before. It's nowhere in any of the historical statistics. And it's still flowing into the system. So the Fed raises interest rates from nothing to 5%, which isn't really, that's normal. It's not really raising them. But it's had almost no effect so far because there's still that $19 trillion pile of cash that is being drawn down. Now, at some point, it'll be drawn down to normal. People will panic. You know, there's no more extra cash to spend, and we'll have the big recession that's coming, but has been delayed, but not, eliminated.
So we had the same, again, the same story in Australia. The stimulus checks were, being spent in pent-up demand ways, in particular ways, whatever was permissible. But then we had also on top of that a legislated, basically legislated theft that is our superannuation system, where essentially people are forced to have a certain amount of their, their earnings paid out to a superannuation account, which is like a pension fund. Depending on your industry, it's different, but is 17% or 9% of your salary, and you can't touch it until you retire, right? And so it's sort of sitting there, and essentially this just gives a vehicle for the middlemen who run these superannuation funds to get rich off of your own wealth, right? So it's not like an IRA where you can choose, so it's very different. But what the government can do is, since they have this system, right, when things get tough, they can say, oh, let me be generous.
We'll let you take
I will, exactly. I will allow that you, and it was up to something like $12 or $10 or $12,000, which is, for cash, really, and particularly when you can only spend on certain things. And this is for every person, not just every household, but every person who has a superannuation account. And so, as you're saying, we still haven't seen kind of the true effect of all the mismanagement. And that, of course, gives fuel to the people who will criticize and say, but, there aren't all these horrible economic effects of these decisions because, look, right, GDP is fine because, we're counting these government handouts and people are still employed because, the unemployment rate hasn't really, it's low, it's historically at lows in Australia, actually, right, the official unemployment rate. And people seem to be able to buy things. There's like lots of demand, people are, companies are saying we need more workers. We need to find skilled workers. Let's bring in more immigrants. We need to have, so it kind of looks a little bit like a healthy economy in some ways. And so the people who would like to, defend what was done have fodder to do that. So that's a real problem at the moment, I think.
We could have a full conference on this. I guess we need to move on, although there's so much more to talk about. The latest BLS jobs data looks catastrophic to me, but they keep hiding it. It's getting worse. Exactly. Well, I'm going to finish this panel with this. I will tell you that my entire life, it never occurred to me not to trust government economic data until the last several years. And now I don't believe a word of it. Good for you. So yeah, just another thing to lose trust in, right? So anyway, let's thank Gigi and David.